Hi everyone. My name's Yvonne Vanke. I live in Newcastle and I'm chair of Northeast for Europe. But tonight it's absolutely fantastic to have people from Yorkshire, from the Northwest, from the Northeast, and maybe from other areas too. So welcome to everyone. It's absolutely wonderful to have you here. I would just like to say how much I have appreciated personally, and our group has appreciated, working with other local groups around the north and the rest of the country over the last few years. And there's just been absolutely fantastic cooperation, friendship, solidarity, all of the absolutely lovely things that are part of being European. And we are still European and we're not giving up. And that's why we're here tonight. I would now like to hand over to Lord Adonis. We're absolutely delighted to have you here and to hear what you have to say to us. So over to you, Lord Adonis.
Yvonne, thank you very much. And huge thanks also to Scott, who started the call, who's done an absolutely brilliant job organising this regional tour. And can I just say, Yvonne, I'm very glad that you're not having to do a Jackie Weaver in whatever it's called, Handforth Parish Council, and start shutting me up and excluding me because I've already started doing outrageous things. So we've all been transfixed by it this evening. I have to say the European movement is an absolute model of propriety and how to conduct its affairs with good nature, even as we inevitably do, vigorous debates. And I always think that part of the art of successful politics is to be able to disagree agreeably. And in the European movement, of course, we've been involved in a big national disagreement over Brexit. I mean, maybe in some ways the biggest that happens in my lifetime. But we are one country, and we do need to go together to move forward together. And we've got to find a way if we're going to bring Britain back into the European mainstream, which is what those of us in the European movement want. We've got to find a way of doing this by building a broad and successful national consensus, and that in many ways is the challenge ahead. And that's particularly going to be a particularly difficult challenge, given that we've got a double crisis that we're going through. Brexit was one crisis, which we warned against, and is, I'm afraid, having many of the consequences that we feared. But also, of course, layered upon that has come a second crisis of COVID, which of course is a short-term crisis simply in dealing with the problem of the pandemic, vaccinations, travel, creating a civilized life again out of the horror that we've had in the last year of a kind of modern plague. But also there's going to be a huge growth problem afterwards as unemployment rockets, and there's a real danger of a kind of 1930s style spiral to the bottom, and Europe needs to be part of the way of preventing that. But at the same time, of course, the short-term consequences will be, I suspect, a resurgence of nationalism, and particularly here in Britain, where we've already done Brexit to reinforce a lot of those forces which led to Brexit in the first place. So it's a very, very challenging time. And when I said I'd be glad to do another talk, because my last one was in November, once we'd seen what had happened in January with the start of Brexit, I'll be quite frank, I hadn't realised things would be as bad as they are. We're into now the second in many European countries, the third lockdown. There's virtually no European travel at all. Though we have got the vaccine, and thank God for that, and it is starting to spread, nonetheless, it's going to be the summer before any semblance of normality returns. It could easily be longer than that. Rather depressingly, a kind of European battle has broken out over vaccine competition and who can do what best and all that, but with real problems behind it, which is how quickly can you secure supplies of vaccine and inoculate your population. So real big and ongoing crisis there. And of course, we've had the introduction of the Brexit Agreement, where I and my fellow parliamentarians spent until a late hour on the 30th of December debating and enacting in almost a kind of shotgun way, with almost no notice at all, the Brexit deal, which I warned at the time was going to be very bad. I mean, it was marginally better than having no deal, but it was still going to be bad. And I'm afraid our worst fears have been realised. And in Northern Ireland ports at the moment, there's a kind of standoff with violence and intimidation and a real crisis over the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and that's only in month 2 of the Brexit deal. So we're in for a very, very tough period. But I'm one of nature's optimists, which you need to be in this context. And my big message this evening is that my profound belief, is that we are at the low point. And we're at the low point in 2 senses. In respect of this modern plague, COVID-19, it does appear that we are getting a handle on it, that we will get a vaccine, and that though it's going to be an iterative process and we're going to require vaccines probably for many years to come, and who knows how many different strains of this virus there may be in the period ahead, it's hard to think we're not going to be better equipped for dealing with it hereafter than we have been when it suddenly hit us coming out of Wuhan a year ago. And it's also my belief that European cooperation will become stronger as we advance too, as we get more established production processes for vaccines, authentication and regulatory processes in place for dealing with them too, and more stable partnerships between Britain and the European Union. I think the intense competition that we've seen over the last month, which has been genuinely difficult because the first duty of the state is to protect its citizens, and I in no way blame. Got many other complaints about Boris Johnson and the government, but I certainly don't complain that they've sought to secure significant and early supplies of vaccine. I think that was absolutely the right thing for the British government to seek to do. But of course, that has involved real competition between us and the European Union for this, and getting more stability on that front will be good for both of us in the period ahead. So I think we've hit the bottom in respect of COVID-19, and things will improve. And in respect of Brexit, my view is, though there are some worrying signs that we haven't hit the bottom there, but my view is that with a jittery period still to come over the Northern Ireland Protocol, where it's already clear that Michael Gove and wound up by Arlene Foster and the DUP in Northern Ireland, is making a last-ditch attempt essentially to remove the protocol. It's my view that something like the protocol will have to continue, because otherwise you still have this problem of a hard border in Ireland. And that provided we get through this period, and as I say, it's a slightly jittery period, and I'm not absolutely sure we've hit the bottom, but we must be at about the bottom in terms of our relations with the European Union. Once we're through that, I think all of the pressure and tendencies of the next few years will be towards more cooperation, not less cooperation. And that's partly because the really frenetic bitterness of the last 3 years will dissipate once we've actually got a trade deal and it's being implemented. But it's also because I think that many of the things we've warned about the negative impacts of this deal, because it's suppressing trade unduly, particularly in services where it doesn't cover them at all, will become apparent. And I think in a pragmatic way, this government, even under its current leadership, but even more so, I suspect, when Boris Johnson goes, will seek, I think, in a pragmatic way to negotiate a closer relationship with the European Union, whilst continuing, of course, to claim that Brexit is a huge success. And the issue, as I see it, for the opposition parties over the next few years is whether they stake out a much more radical position, as I would wish them to do, on renegotiating the Brexit deal, rather than simply inching towards a more constructive relationship with the EU, as I think will happen. So as Mark Twain famously said on reading of his obituary in the newspapers, rumours of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Rumours of the death of pro-Europeanism in Britain are greatly exaggerated. The European Union, though it's going through tough times like everyone at the moment in respect of dealing with COVID-19, it's fundamentally robust. Its core trade and economic functions are clearly as relevant now as they've ever been. The growth and post-COVID package, which the EU has put in place, is as ambitious as anything that's being done anywhere in the world, including with the 1.9 trillion package that President Biden is seeking to steer through the US Congress as we speak. And as we come out of COVID, it's my view that the European Union will still be the absolutely central continent-wide institution in terms of steering Europe's economies and nations post-Brexit. And we will need to seek a closer, and I hope radically closer before too long, relationship with it as a matter of economic survival as much as ideological preference. So what does that mean for us in the European movement? I think it means three things. It means keeping the faith, having absolute confidence that our pro-European beliefs are correct. I mean, obviously, they're correct in the sense that we are European. You know, there are millions of citizens from other EU states who are still resident in Britain and are going to remain here. I mean, we are intertwined as much as we were before Brexit in fundamental ways. We should keep the faith that that is going to continue to be the case. But secondly, I think we need to be increasingly in campaign mode, again, after what's clearly been a year of some depression amongst pro-Europeans in Britain, increasingly in campaign mode in two respects. Firstly, in rebutting and pointing out all of the problems that are going to result and are already starting to result from this bare bones trade deal, which is being implemented at the moment. And as that becomes increasingly apparent next year, we've got to be in serious rebuttal mode to link what are the growing problems that there will be in terms of trading with the EU, enhanced bigger prices in the shops because of the impact of Brexit. You know, we're already talking about £1.50 on a bottle of French wine because of Brexit. We're going to see story after story like that over the months ahead. So be in serious rebuttal mode. And then, in my view, and this is the medium-term mission for the European movement, is to start making the case for a fundamental renegotiation of the trade deal, which came into effect at the beginning of this year. And my view is that what we should be seeking to campaign for in the run-up to the next general election, which will be probably in 2024, is re-entry into the customs union and as much of the single market as we can negotiate entry into, which I think is eminently feasible. That, after all, is what Switzerland, Norway, and other European countries that aren't in the EU have done. They've all of them have got a fundamentally closer relationship with the EU based on all or part of the customs union and the single market. So it's eminently possible, and I think it will be politically and economically essential by 2024, because I don't think there will be a credible growth plan for the country that doesn't involve renegotiating Boris Johnson's trade deal to ensure that impediments to trade, which are suppressing economic activity and making us poorer, that those aren't dealt with so that we get much closer to the EU. Now, I know there's a bit of a debate inside the European movement about how robustly we should be calling for re-entry into the EU. And my view on this one is very pragmatic. Neither I nor anyone else in the meeting this evening have stopped believing that the best place for Britain is in the European Union. That is my belief. And it's also my belief that before too long, I wouldn't want to put a date on it, but before too long, Britain probably will be back in the EU, because it's partly a matter of destiny, but also a matter of pragmatism in terms of delivering what the British people will want in terms of a stronger economy. And it's very notable at the moment that opinion polls show, as they have done throughout the last 2 years, that a majority want to be in the EU, and a majority of the British people at the moment think that Brexit was a mistake. And that's, I think, quite important, because though there was an election in December 2010 that returned the Conservatives, it did not show then or any time since the majority of people think that Brexit was a good idea. That was basically the election which was a straight choice between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. It doesn't particularly surprise me as a Labour person that people weren't wildly keen on Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister, but that didn't mean that they wanted to go along with Brexit too. So we've been forced into this Brexit through the straitjacket of that December 19 election, which, as I say, was basically about who people wanted to be Prime Minister. But the fundamental engagement philosophy, pragmatic philosophy of the British people, I don't believe has changed. And so my view is that saying that we are in favour of being in the EU is the right thing for those of us who believe it, which will be most of us on this call this evening. In terms of how we get there, I think it will obviously be in stages. We're not going to go back in one go. And I think that the first significant stage to returning will be re-entry to the customs union and a large part of the single market. That, of course, is compatible with Brexit. Indeed, it is Brexit, because, of course, you can be in the single market and the customs union whilst not being in the European Union, as other European countries have showed. And once we've achieved that goal, which, as I say, I hope we can do in the next 5 or 6 years, if the politics are aligned, after that, I think the debate will then move on to re-entry. And what all of this means is that the role, mission and campaigning purpose of the European movement remain as important as ever. And they remain particularly important in the regions which are meeting this evening, the Northeast, the Northwest and Yorkshire, because to be absolutely blunt about it, that is where we lost Brexit. We lost the referendum in these regions. Not only in these regions, we also lost it in the Southwest and large parts of the home counties and narrowly in Wales. But the areas where we lost it most were in the regions which are meeting this evening. And it's in those regions which, alas, I think economically are going to be most seriously hit by Brexit. It's in those regions that we've got to win the argument for, first of all, going back into the customs union and the single market, which I hope may be possible soon after the next general election if the politics comes together. We've got to win that argument in the 3 regions which are meeting this evening before, in my view, we can carry the country. And once we've won that argument to those 3 regions, I think we can then start looking seriously at the argument for rejoining the EU itself. So thanks for joining this evening. I'm still fundamentally an optimist. I'm not negligent of the crises that we face and the great challenges that we're going to have in overcoming it, nor in the campaigning challenges that we've got in making ourselves relevant over the next few years. But our fundamental message is correct. Our fundamental strategy, which is to seek to re-enter the European Union in stages, and I've laid out 3 stages. The first is essentially calling out all the failures of the current deal. The second is putting on the map, political map, in a really serious way, re-entry into the customs union and the single market. And the third stage would then be seeking to re-enter the European Union itself. That strategy, I believe, is fundamentally sound. And as we celebrate what's been an enormous success for the politics that we represent of international cooperation and optimism, which is the election of President Biden and the transition of power in the United States 3 weeks ago now, as we celebrate that, I think we could see a kind of politics which could lead fundamentally to a renaissance of pro-European sentiment in this country in the years ahead, provided we campaign, we don't give up the faith, and we remain really seriously engaged. And the number that are in this call, I can see 74 people are in the call at the moment, and they haven't been able to read the chat. There seems to be a vibrant chat going on too, is a very, very good sign, because in my experience, to get a seriously motivated political gathering together, you only need 3 or 4. Indeed, that Handsworth Parish Council, all of that aggro appeared to be about 6 people. Well, we've got 74 on this call, and that's just in 3 regions of the European movement. So just think what we can all do across the country when we're all gathered together and really going for it. Yvonne, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's get a discussion going.
Thank you. Scott.
Great, thanks, Andrew, for that one. As you said, we've had quite a vibrant discussion in the chat box, and we've also had quite a few questions sent in advance. And I realised that at the start of the meeting, in the sort of the blur that was the start of my 7th Zoom meeting of the day, I didn't mention about the Q&A session. So we are, of course, now going to do a Q&A with Lord Adonis. So if you do have a question to pose, you can either put it in the chat box, or you can use the raise your hand feature in Zoom, and we'll get to your questions, well, as many of the questions as we can. But we've had quite a few submitted in advance, and maybe the first one I'll put to is one that was submitted in advance by Simon, touching on the election of President Biden, which you closed with. He says, what are the possibilities of the Prime Minister trying for or getting a kind of trade deal with the US after the election of Joe Biden anytime soon?
I would have thought the possibilities are approaching zero. And you saw it in the statement that followed the introductory conversation between Joe Biden and Boris Johnson, which, even though Number 10 said that they discussed the possibility of a trade deal, it wasn't even mentioned in the White House statement. Not even mentioned. It wasn't said as something that would be on the agenda amongst 6 or 7 other priorities. It wasn't even mentioned. What was mentioned at great length was defence cooperation, and that's where the United States and the UK still remain very close allies, and will continue to be so, and rightly so. And that, of course, is the reason why President Biden made his first call to Boris Johnson, because he's Prime Minister of the UK, and we are still with France, one of the only 2 serious military powers in Europe. And of course, that's vitally important to him because of the Western alliance. So there's no indication whatsoever that President Biden is going. Actually, I don't think he's likely to be prioritising trade deals at large at the moment. He's got a massive job of work in getting the United States out of COVID-19 and getting back on a growth track at all. And the Democratic Party, indeed American politics at large, isn't wildly keen on, because it's in a sort of quasi-protectionist phase at the moment. It's not wildly keen on trade deals at the moment. What he'll be seeking to do, because he is a free trader, is to maintain the existing trade deals the United States has, particularly with its neighbours, because of course the most of America's trade, like most of our trade, this is the great lunacy of Brexit, is it's with its neighbours, and so he'll be seeking in particular to maintain the Pan-American trade deal, and particularly close trade relations with Canada and with Mexico. And actually, the very first call that Biden made, as American presidents always make, was with the Prime Minister of Canada. And I don't think that there's going to be a prioritization of new trade deals beyond it. And in any case, if Britain were to be one of the people that they were seeking to reach a trade deal with, I don't think we would be high on the list at the moment. But trade relations in the Pacific are going to be very problematic for the United States in the period ahead, particularly with China. And I think that's going to have the effects of depressing enthusiasm in Congress and in the administration for new trade deals of any kind. And even if there were to be serious trade negotiations in a Congress where there's a Democrat majority of 10 in the House of Representatives and literally a 50-50 split in the Senate, the idea of anything being ratified over the next few years is chimeral. So it's the trade that matters to us, and this was always the case in the past, and it will always be the case in the future. The trade that matters to us over and above all else is the trade with our European partners, beginning with the Republic of Ireland, because that is our closest partner. We actually share a physical border with the Republic of Ireland, which is why this Northern Ireland Protocol is so crucially important, and seeing we get stable and non-acrimonious trade relations on the island of Ireland. And all of this nonsense about global Britain, meaning we're going to be seeking to strike trade deals beyond, is so much hot air and nonsense at the moment, when we don't even have stable trading relations with our immediate partners. And I think it's likely to be some time before we do reach a point of stability, given all the teething problems, which I think may be in some respects fundamental problems, not just teething problems, with the EU trade agreement that was agreed at that was implemented in January. And it's very important to understand that when the government goes on about new trade agreements beyond the EU, all of those are rollover agreements in respect of existing agreements which the EU has with those countries, which we are replicating, or as close as damn it, replicating outside the EU. And though the government's doing its best to dress these deals up as if they're somehow new and better, there's not a single one that's been done so far that is anything other than 98, 99% rolling over the existing one. And insofar as they're different, it's because they have less in them, because the partners that we're seeking to agree these rollover agreements with won't give us quite as much as they gave the EU. So classically, the Japan deal, which the government was busy lauding as a great new breakthrough in Britain's international trade relations, turns out to be an almost cut and paste job of the EU-Japan trade deal that was agreed 2 years ago, except that the independent assessments of it, looking at the changes in detail, say that it's actually worth less to the UK economy because of the sectors covered and the way they're covered than the EU deal was. And when I said in my opening remarks that we've got to be really on the button in terms of the rebuttal, that is one big area where we've got to really be doing the rebuttal, pointing out that there's just a massive burst of hot air from the government at the moment about global Britain meaning new international trading opportunities, where in fact there's either no change or things are worse than they would have been inside the EU.
Great, thanks. That leads quite well on, now you've mentioned the deal with the EU, leads on to one of the first questions that was posed in the chat today from Jacqueline Williams. She asks, as a Labour peer, how do you feel about Keir Starmer's support, albeit with some caveats, for the deal in December? She said that she personally feels appalled that there's no major party that she can turn to at the moment.
Well, I voted against the deal. I voted against it out of fundamental principle. I think the deal is a very bad deal for Britain. But I wasn't persuaded by Keir's arguments that it was a choice between that deal and no deal. That wasn't the choice, because the government has a majority of 80, so its deal was going to go through anyway. And I think politically it was a mistake to vote for it in any case, because by voting for the deal, of course, you make it much harder to criticise the deal afterwards. And I intend, as one of your representatives, to be criticising this deal intensely in the months and years ahead, because it's a very, very bad deal. So I think it was a fundamental mistake, not a small mistake, but a fundamental political mistake, voting for the deal. And I don't think it's any accident that Labour's fallen behind in the polls since January either. And I think part of the reason why is because we haven't got enough to say. You know, politics is about messages and about winning arguments. You can't win arguments unless you make arguments. And I'm not in the same place as the Conservatives. Not on just Brexit at large. I think Brexit was the wrong policy fundamentally for the country, but nor am I in the same place, and nor actually are the great majority of Labour Party members even on this deal as a form of Brexit. The overwhelming majority of Labour Party members, including, I imagine, large numbers who are on this call this evening, who are in the Labour Party, think we should have stayed in the customs union and the single market. And though obviously we couldn't impose that in December because we weren't in government, we should have been voting for it. And I did vote for that. I voted both against the deal in the House of Lords, and I voted for a motion which said that we should have sought and should still be seeking to negotiate continued membership of the customs union and the best deal we can get in terms of the single market. So there's no point papering over the cracks. I'm in a fundamentally different position to Keir on the handling of European policy. And my own view is this is the reason why the European movement is so important, is I don't think Labour will become electable until we are putting a fundamentally different European policy before the British people in 2024. And that, I think, has to be something like rejoining the customs union and negotiating a kind of quasi-semi-membership of the single market. And the reason I think that isn't just because of the European argument, but because elections, in all my political experience, elections are won or lost on who has the best deal for the economy. Elections are fundamentally about people's jobs and livelihoods and how they see the country getting better. And I do not believe that Labour or any of the opposition parties will be able to offer a fundamentally better economic message and prospectus for the country in 2024 unless they can offer a fundamentally better deal on trade, because so much of the growth penalty we're going to pay from Brexit is going to come from the nature of the trade deal, which, as we can already see, is going to force up prices, send companies out of business, and introduce massive red tape. And what we need to be, all of the opposition parties, is putting a prospectus, I hope a fairly united prospectus, behind the country in 2024 for less red tape, lower prices, and more trade. and therefore more companies which are able to trade. And that can only come from fundamentally renegotiating the trade deal, which came into effect on the 1st of January. So I hope I haven't been mincing my words. I hope I've given you a clear enough answer to your question. And I think it's very important to have this argument out, because in my experience, whereas party loyalty is all very important in second order things, and personally I like Keir. I mean, I've got personally a great deal of respect for him. There's no point papering on the cracks on big issues, particularly big issues which are fundamental to the interests of the country and also fundamental to Labour and the opposition party's electability in 3 years' time.
Great. And you mentioned the economy just there, and there's been quite a few questions, both in advance and in the chat, about the economy. Simon, who sent in a couple of questions, said, how bad do you think the economy is likely to get over the next several years? I guess both because of COVID-19 and because of the Brexit deal. So what sort of changes do you think we'll be seeing?
I think it's going to be very, very grim. I mean, we're clearly going to go to a period of mass unemployment, both a huge increase in the claimant count for universal credit. I mean, that's already been rocketing, but also a lot of informal unemployment as well. And as soon as support measures like furlough schemes start to be withdrawn, the impact is going to be really profound. Now, that's not just going to be in Britain, that's going to be international, obviously, because there's been a massive shock, a kind of a global heart attack in terms of the operation of our economies. But the key point about it, so far as we're concerned in the European movement, is to have a double shock of a hard Brexit and all the problems we're going to have post-COVID-19 is obviously fundamentally antipathetic to the interests of the country. And I think once we're out of the business of the moment, which of course is getting people vaccinated and so on, where frankly, I'll be quite frank, I think the government's policy is about right on that front. So getting that implemented is the right thing for us to do. Once we're through that, I think the fundamental fault lines of politics and our European policy are going to reassert themselves quite quickly.
Great. There's one more question which I want to ask on the economy before we move on to other questions, and it's specifically about regional funding. And David, who was in the chat earlier but seems to have disappeared now, said, do you think the new funding sources will adequately replace the European funding for regions such as the North East, Northwestern Yorkshire?
I very much doubt it, because I suspect the amounts of money the government's going to put in are going to be less. But there's the other reason why I think they'll have less impact is that because the EU had a regional policy, which was published overt with criteria and all that, it was good at long-term funding. It gave much longer-term funding than the British government has ever given for regional programmes. And it was much more predictable in where it was going to go in the future because the criteria are much clearer. For example, the deprivation criteria were published and clear, so you knew the regions which were going to gain. Now, we can already see, I mean, this guy, Robert Jenrick, and the way he's been sort of gerrymandering in a very narrow political way, the distribution of money from central government in this thing called the Towns Fund, that is a really terrible precedent and indication of what's going to happen to regional funding, which is even the lesser sums that are put into regional funding than were available under the EU's regional funds, I think are likely to be allocated on short-term and capricious criteria, which I'm afraid to say are likely to be much more closely aligned to the perceived political interests of the Conservative Party than actual requirements for regional development. And that's going to be very, very bad news for the regional programmes across the country.
And following on from talk about regions of the UK, that follows on quite nicely into questions about Scotland. And there's a couple of questions in the chat and a question which was submitted in advance, which are kind of linked. In the chat, John's asking, for your thoughts on how Brexit was an English project which was pushed forward onto the devolved nations like Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. And in advance, a question was sent in, how do you see the issue of Scottish independence playing out over the next few years? I thought I'd ask those two together because they're kind of linked.
Well, everything depends, of course, on what happens in May in the Scottish elections. If the SNP wins a majority of votes and seats, then it will claim a strong mandate for holding another independence referendum. And my political judgment is that if they win a majority of votes and seats, and that's quite a high hurdle, and I wouldn't take it for granted that they will get there, And there seems to be quite a lot of infighting within the SNP at the moment. I mean, just for casual observers looking at the papers, you can see that. So, and the Labour Party is about to elect a new and I think much better leader in Scotland. So it may be that they don't get over the 50% hurdle. If they do, then I think a second independence referendum will become quite quickly irresistible. If they don't get over it, then it may be that it can be held off for some time. So the first issue is what happens in May. Now, there's so much uncertainty after that. I don't think there's much point in my saying much beyond there, because in my experience of politics, once you've gone through one big process of uncertainty, trying to predict what's going to happen beyond that is very hard. And the first big period and process of uncertainty is the May elections. And so all I can see, I can't really see at all clearly beyond the May elections. All I can say this evening, and I know it's obvious, but I think it is my judgment, is that what really matters in these May elections in Scotland is whether the SNP does or doesn't get over 50% in votes and seats. If they do, then, as I say, I think that they will have a mandate, so we'll be able to claim a mandate for a referendum. And though Boris Johnson will probably try to resist it in the short term, and legally, of course, the United Kingdom government and Parliament has to agree, I don't think that'll be a viable policy for them in the medium term. So that's the big initial test. And that's not far away, of course, because we're already in February. So we're only 3 months away. And in 6 months' time, we could be in a completely different ballgame.
And I guess a lot of that depends on what happens with COVID. I mean, there's so many different models about what might happen in the next 6 to 12 months. And Michael just asked a question about that in the chat. He says, do you think that COVID gives the government a bit of a get-out clause over Brexit, and the damage to the economy because of Brexit is going to be a bit of overshadowed by COVID?
I don't think it gives them a get-out on the economy, because the economy is going to be very, very weak after Brexit, and people won't be, I think, much persuaded by arguments that we shouldn't do things to improve it because of ideological concerns about Brexit. So I think if it becomes very apparent, particularly if we in the European movement do a very good job of making it apparent, that part of the reason why unemployment is so high and the economy is doing so badly after COVID is because of Brexit, I think we can then turn that argument around quite quickly. The issue that I think is in the short term is harder to handle for us pro-Europeans is the fact that, to be absolutely frank, and there's no point not being frank, and I always am frank and tell you what I think, the European Union itself hasn't handled COVID itself particularly well, whereas most of the member governments have done a pretty good job of handling lockdowns and all of that, and many of them better than we've done. The European Union's own negotiation and procurement process for the vaccines hasn't been great, and I'll be quite frank, it appears to have been a lot less good than the UK government. And in the short term, that is going and already has led to a Brexit argument that it's because of Brexit that we've been ahead of the game on vaccines. Now, the truth is, you can argue this issue until in all kinds of different ways. I mean, if you want me to, I can go through some of the arguments in due course, but it will be an argument used, and it is an argument that's being used, that it's because of Brexit that we were able to have a much faster rollout of the vaccine, and the EU, and in particular the European Commission, have been much slower. And I'll be quite frank, I don't think the European Commission, I never defend people who don't do a good job. I don't think the European Commission has done a good job in respect of negotiating either the industrial requirements for producing vaccine or the contractual issues of getting the vaccine fast, or indeed possibly even the issue of giving it regulatory consents. It does appear to have been behind the curve. And the President of the European Commission, who I have enormous respect for, Ursula von der Leyen as a person, her statement today that the member states or individual states can act as speedboats while the European Union is a tanker, I cannot think of a worse analogy for the role of the European Union. If the peoples of Europe think that when it comes to dealing with crises, to get swift action, you've got to look to the member states, and by its very nature, the European Union and the European Commission are a tanker that take forever to turn around and are much slower, that will do huge damage to the European cause. That was an extremely ill-judged remark on her part. And indeed, it's a remark, if it's true, and that's what she believes of the organisation that she runs, then my God, she needs to engage in a very, very big and rapid process of reforming that organisation, because the peoples of Europe will not accept that when it comes to dealing with their vital interests, the European Union and the European Commission are a tanker that take forever to turn around. They will expect, and rightly so, that the European Commission and the European Union does act like a speedboat. And that is exactly, I know if I was in government myself and was responsible for these affairs, I would have been on their case immediately as they started making remarks of that kind. So what's happening in the short term is quite a challenge for the European Union and particularly for the European Commission, and I don't think that they've handled it well. However, I also don't think that this reflects either on the case of Brexit. I don't think it changes the fact that Brexit's a big mistake for us, nor do I think it changes the case for Europe in the medium term, because in the medium term, it clearly is the case that we do need to have a pan-European industrial policy when it comes to producing vaccines and being on the top of modern biotech research and collaboration. Obviously we do. And the fact that there is necessarily short-term pressures and competition to see that we do act as a speedboat and not as a tanker in dealing with this immediate crisis. And let's be clear why. It's because huge numbers of lives are at stake, and people rightly look to government, whether it's European government or national government, to protect them in a moment of acute danger, and rightly so. Once we're through this immediate danger, all of the necessity that has always been there for European collaboration and cooperation and trade, including trade in vaccines and in all of the industrial systems that are a part of it, all of that will still be there. So government is tough. I mean, life is tough, and we're going through a tough period at the moment, but I don't think that the fundamental arguments for collaboration and cooperation have changed at all.
Yeah, I had to say, when I read that analogy this afternoon, I was a bit shocked by that as well. That was definitely not the right analogy to be using. It almost made it seem like, oh, Brexit is this speedboat going off into the distance really, really quickly. But
and it's very important. You see, it's very important that we make the right arguments. If the populations of Europe think that to get swift and decisive and effective action dealing with the crises that face them, you've got to look to your nation states because they can act fast, and Europe acts slowly, the European project will be over. Let's be clear about that. So it's a major misstatement and mishandling of the issue, in my view, the way that the vaccine issue has been handled. But governments don't get everything right. I mean, my God, look at the things that Boris Johnson has got wrong in mishandling the Brexit, the COVID thing over the last year. And we obviously can't claim that the British nation state at large has done a better job than the governments of France, Germany and the European Union. It's this specific and immediate issue of the rollout of the vaccines, which is the issue, in my view, is that the EU needs to learn from this very rapidly.
Yeah, just before we move on to the next question, just a comment from myself, I think this whole situation with the analogy today really does highlight the importance of messaging. When you're doing anything, whether it's a statement, a campaign, leaflet, post on social media, whatever it is. And that's why I can see quite a few of our group chairs in the participants list, who are probably quite bored of us talking about messaging all the time. But this is why that's so important, because if you get even just one word or one analogy wrong, it can throw off your whole campaign.
That's completely right. Absolutely correct.
Another issue which people have been talking about quite a bit is obviously the issue around visas to musicians, which has been in the news quite a bit recently. Jean Compton, who I can see is in the participants list, but sent this in advance, said, what can we do to help on the issue of visa problems for artists and musicians who want to perform on either side of the channel?
Do we have any artists and musicians in the meeting? Because I'd really like to hear from one or two of them.
We have Rachel. Yeah, I'll add her to the spotlight.
Could one or two of them come in and tell us what are the problems that they're now facing, and what it's actually like on the front line of being an artist and musician and contemplating the new regime?
Well, I have friends who remember the touring before being members of the single market and the carnets, and when you think about it, for a band to tour, they even had to log a plectrum. And when you think about the amount of gear that are banned, for example, my husband did a lot of children's shows in Northern Ireland, and he took like a whole band with him. And in those days, having to log everything, it is absolutely crazy, and especially within the island of Ireland. It basically means touring within the European Union is no longer feasible financially. And from my own point of view, I mean, I don't do a lot of live stuff anymore, but I do have a lot of European clients. And I've worked for a company in France this month. Now that's fine. They can send me the work and I can send back the files, but I don't know whether they can pay me or not. And nobody can tell me.
Yeah. Well, that is a terrible situation. Do we have any other artists, musicians on the call who can tell us their own experience or the experience of friends?
I'm just having a look through the thumbnails now. If you're an artist or a musician, just sort of wave your hand at the camera and I'll browse through. Can't see any more in there that are waving their hands at the camera.
But what's my view? I mean, this is one of the initial really, really serious crises, because this is a whole sector. We're not just talking about individual artists and musicians, important though they are. This is a whole industrial sector, and a very successful, I mean, a much, much bigger sector than fishing in terms of the numbers of people employed and the contribution it makes to the economy and all of that. I mean, it's a huge sector. The creative industry is one of the most successful things we do as a country. So it's going to have a massive impact, and we need to be highlighting it case by case. Of course, it's been slightly reduced by the very fact of COVID-19 and the fact that, of course, you can't travel anywhere at the moment. But as soon as normality returns from this summer or whenever it is after that, this is going to become an absolute crisis issue. One of my greatest friends is Howard Goodall, the composer, and who's constantly touring and performing. And he thinks that this could decimate the entire creative industries. And the government hasn't even begun to understand the scale of the problem. And the fact that Boris Johnson appears to have thought that because you can travel across Europe as a tourist, this meant that artists could travel freely with their equipment and do gigs, showed he didn't even begin to understand what the problem was, let alone what the solution was. And so I and others will be continuing to agitate strongly on this issue in Parliament. And I think this is exactly the kind of issue which they're going to have to start renegotiating quite quickly.
Before I move on to the last section of questions, it's funny you mentioned Howard Goodall, actually. We are actually announcing an event next week. I can't talk about it now, where Howard's going to be one of the speakers there. We're going to be talking about a lot of those issues. He's got a lot of great things to say on that, so we're excited about that. Moving on to the subject about where do we go on from here. Well, I guess we partially answered it with the analogy about speedboats earlier, but Chris Power is asking, well, why do Eurosceptics hate the EU so much, and what can we do about that?
Why do they hate it? Well, of course, there are, and always have been in Britain, some who either because of a peculiar belief that sovereignty can't be shared, or because they're sort of xenophobic and in some cases racist, have never liked the EU. My view has always been, which hasn't changed from touring the North and doing all the stuff I've done over the last 3 years, that that's a very small proportion, no more than a few percent of the population that are in either category. What happened and what got to the 52% was two things. Firstly, 30 years relentlessly of Murdoch and the Daily Mail. So literally lies, drip, 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 day by day, week by week, month by month, blaming everything that's going on in the country on some kind of EU plots, which, of course, like the big lie, and your point, Scott, about messaging, once this reaches a certain level, it just becomes pervasive across society, and I'm afraid that's what happened. And the second thing was the reaction, which I was very strongly aware of in the referendum campaign in 2017, the reaction to a decade of austerity and really serious problems caused by the financial crisis of 2008-9, even if there hadn't been austerity, a big contraction in economic activity, including real wages, which for the first time since the Second World War had declined over that period, a reaction against these economic problems. and a belief, partly because of the messaging of the Brexiters, that the country would be better off as a result of Brexit, a belief that the answer to these economic problems was Brexit. And I think it was the combination of those two things, a belief that Britain would be better off as a result of Brexit, plus 30 years of propaganda that all of our problems were caused by Brexit, or our fundamental problems. So Europe became a kind of universal scapegoat. Those were the two things that led to the 52% majority for Brexit. Now, the first is obviously not going to apply over the period ahead, because since we're out of the European Union, it can't be the scapegoat for things that are going wrong. At least if that happens, then we really are not doing our job. If we allow the Daily Mail and the Murdoch press to claim that the problems which Boris Johnson is inflicting on the country are caused by the European Commission, then we're really not even beginning to do our job as campaigners. So that one I don't think will apply. And secondly, on the business about economic growth and all of that, that is a really big challenge for us in the period ahead, is to make the argument, because it's true, that a closer relationship with the EU is going to be vital to producing growth and not part of the reason why growth is lower.
And there's actually been talking about answering that question. There's been a lot of comments about the media coming in on the chat there. And that actually links into two questions which were asked. One by Simon, who's sending quite a few questions in advance. And sorry, no, that's fine question, looking at the wrong section there. One which was sent in by Lillian today, and one which Rachel, who we just heard from, actually asked. Rachel asks, what are your thoughts on overcoming a sticky and increasingly right-wing media who have been sort of perpetuating a lot of these Euromyths? And then Lillian follows on from that. Do we really have a strategy or to rebutting the lies that we see in the tabloids?
Well, it's clearly a massive problem, because the media hasn't become any less right-wing as a result of Brexit starting. On the contrary, their tail is up and they now feel vindicated. And the only way of dealing with it, in my experience, is to have a very strong and popular opposition, that is political opposition. And that's important both for making arguments, particularly through the BBC and the bits of the media that do report them objectively, but also it's important because my knowledge of Murdoch going back some time now is that when the Labour Party in particular starts to become very popular, and he fears, and his editors fear, there might be a Labour government, this has a knock-on effect of them wanting to start being on the right side of that government, because Murdoch then gets very worried about his commercial interests. So in 1997, when Labour won the election, surprise, surprise, Murdoch actually switched to supporting Labour before the election because he could see that Labour was likely to win. And even though he didn't stop being anti-European, he did downplay his anti-Europeanism significantly in that period because it became less popular. So there's a kind of double whammy to having a strong opposition. It's important in its own right to making arguments against the right, but it's also important because the right itself, or at least large parts of the right-wing media, start to move much more towards the centre if they think that Labour and the left might be on course to win a general election. So all of this, I'm afraid, comes back to Keir Starmer and the strength of the Labour opposition. Labour needs to be making the arguments against this hard Brexit and for Europe in order for those arguments to get a fair hearing in the country, particularly in the BBC, the bits of the media that aren't controlled by the right-wing corporate interests. And as it does so and starts to be successful, that then has a knock-on effect, particularly on the Murdoch press. And at the moment, we're not really doing either of those effectively, I'm afraid.
Great, thanks for that. We're coming up on the hour now, but there's two questions which I do want to ask, which are kind of linked together just before we finish off. The question which I started asking earlier from Simon says, what in your view are our chances of the UK rejoining the EU, and what sort of time frame are we looking at? And that links into a question in the chat from Vicky Seddon a little while ago, that how do we persuade people to remain optimistic about a return to Europe?
Good questions. Can I also just, because I could just see it here, Simon Lord's question, which relates to what I've just said, maybe a strong social media strategy would help a bit to counter the tabloid media. That's completely correct. We need to be really onto social media, because after all, that is one of the big forms of media at the moment. And you, Scott, and your colleagues do a great job on social media, but we all need collectively to be out there in a really serious way. Though people much derided FBP and all that, the reason why we got quite close to a second referendum was precisely because there was such a powerful grassroots movement. And if we'd only had a better led Labour Party, we hadn't had Jeremy Corbyn, I think we might have won that. So social media is hugely important. What do I think are the chances and the timescales of going back in? I think the chances are fundamentally good of re-entering the European Union. Because the fundamental arguments haven't changed. All the reasons why we went into the EU in the 1970s, because we were at a massive economic disadvantage from being outside, they will reassert themselves, those arguments, in the 2020s, if we're not back in by the 2030, in the 2030s. So those arguments haven't fundamentally changed. I can't really predict the timescale. It's very hard to predict at the moment. I think it has a lot to do with how quickly the Labour Party becomes electable again. Because to go back into the European Union, I think that's going to have to be a project of a non-Conservative government, probably. I may be wrong about that. You know, you never know. After all, it was the Conservatives who took us into Europe in the 1970s. So it may be that the Conservative Party changes much more rapidly than we think. But I don't think it's going to, because I think this Europhobia and nationalism has gripped the party to such an extent that probably it's going to need to be the Labour Party that takes us back into the EU. So I think the critical issue in terms of the timescale for reversing Brexit is going to be how quickly Labour becomes electable again. And how can I put it? That at the moment is work in progress.
Yeah, just on that second question I mentioned there, well, how would you persuade people to remain optimistic about that? Because I think all of us on the call today, including myself and you, Andrew, we agree that is the right path, and we agree that that will happen in the future. But how do you persuade people to remain optimistic about that?
Well, why should we be optimistic? Because fundamentally, all the arguments on Europe are with us. That hasn't changed. Also, because we are Europeans, that hasn't fundamentally changed. The geography of this country hasn't suddenly changed because of Brexit. And on the political side, the reason I'm optimistic is that politics abhors a vacuum in democracies. You know, we're not a one-party state which can abolish the opposition, thank God, and that hasn't changed. And so if Labour proves to be weak and the current Labour leadership proves to be weak, something will come in and fill that space. And it hasn't been the case, if you look at our parliamentary history over the last century, since we've been a democracy, that we've gone for more than about 15 years without there being a change of party in government. And though sometimes that 15 years can go to closer to 20, alas, it did under Thatcher and Major, when Labour was really incompetently led in that period. It's never gone longer than that. So, though I can unfortunately see the circumstances where Labour still loses the next election if we're badly led, I think the shock that will cause would be so great that we would then have to get ourselves back into a position of being electable after that. Because we're not a one-party state, and the British people won't accept us being a one-party state either. So I'm fundamentally an optimist. The campaigning prospectus for us is still absolutely there. And we've got a big job of work to do as a European movement. And the better the job we do, the quicker it'll be for us to get back into the mainstream of Europe again. So let's go for it.
I think that's a positive message to end on. So thank you very much for that. But just in closing, I want to thank you all for joining today. We had quite a few people that joined for part of it, had to leave a bit earlier. But I want to especially thank all the people I recognise. I can recognise at least a dozen people in the chat who are sort of leading members of our grassroots movement, like either group chairs or active members. And you really are the core of what we're doing alongside the members who are with us tonight. So please keep up the great work you're doing. We're really appreciative of that. And it's great to see the passion that there still is there, even though we haven't been able to get out campaigning on the streets, have any big rallies. In the chat earlier, there was support for more marches, which as the assistant organizer for all the big People's Vote marches, I was quite pleased that you want more marches. But obviously at the moment it's not possible. But keep up that passion, keep up the energy, keep up the enthusiasm. We're all really appreciative of everything you're doing. So thank you so much for all your hard work. And good night for now. And thank you for
keep at it. Thanks for joining this evening, and the future's ours. Thanks very much.
Thank you.